Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Thorek Jensen and I'm a museum curator at the Danish Museum of Science and Technology. Today I will talk about how the roles of science museums must change in order for us to become relevant for the many people who are not using us today and to make offerings for some other people who have not been our core visitors for the past 50 years. I will do this by sharing insights and experiences from the Danish Museum of Science and Technology, where we are experimenting with how we can create new practice and new offerings which is relevant for people who doesn't see science and science museums as something for them. We're working with the concept of science capital as a tool to change our practice, to change our mindset, and to change our working culture. But also with the acknowledgement that science capital is not a fixed set of ideas that can just be copied from one institution to the other or from one country to another. We are investigating and experimenting with science capital and what it means to us. This also includes exploring what it can do to change our institutions so we are more active and attractive fixture in society. This would increase our relevance to various demographics with regard to factors such as gender identity, educational background, spirituality, and sexual orientation. This is what this presentation will focus on. But I will also conclude the presentation by addressing challenges and potentials for science museums and science centers, and that what we need to focus on if we want to be regarded as important and relevant institutions in the society of tomorrow. I will start my presentation with this quote from the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who in 2015, before the adoption of the new UN development goals, said that more of the same will not do. He was of course speaking about how our society was working and functioning at the moment, like from an economical perspective and a social perspective and environmental perspective, but also from a culture perspective. We as culture institutions and science institutions also need to change if we want to contribute to the creation of a better world of tomorrow. So, the Danish Museum of Science and Technology is an independent museum with a national responsibility to deal with the technological and industrial development of Denmark. We receive funding from the Danish government to carry out this work. At the moment, the museum is located north of Copenhagen in a medium-sized town. But within the next 5 years, the museum will relocate and move to Copenhagen into one of the most iconic industrial facilities in the city, an old power station, and transform it into a modern science museum and a hub for companies, organizations, and institutions who are working with the green transformation of the society and the world. The museum was established in 1911 by Danish Industry and the Craftsmen's Association of Copenhagen. The diversity of the collection is enormous, from big steam engines to small smartphones, from the original Lego, a Soyuz space capsule, the first car in Denmark, which can actually still drive, making it the world's oldest functioning car, but also the compass that Hans Christian Ørsted used in 1820 when he discovered electromagnetism, which was a key discovery which led to the development of our modern electrical society. There are approximately 30,000 objects in the collection, and every single one of them is an example of a new idea or a new discoveries. 5 years ago, it was decided to rethink the role of the museum in society, which includes the relocation of the museum to Copenhagen, but also to rethink how we as a science museum functions, what we are doing and what role we are playing in society. The museum is now located in old industrial facilities, which is not suited for a modern museum. In a way, the development of the new museum is also the rebirth of the old museum. This creates an opportunity to completely rethink the role of the museum for its visitors and ultimately society. We are using the existing museum as a laboratory where we can experiment with new ideas, new formats, and new methods. The museum has been granted funding from the biggest foundation in Denmark, the Novo Nordisk Foundation, to experiment with how we can create new science communication and new science education for people who doesn't think science is something for them. The aim of the project is to make visible that science is not just about formulas, but is part of the world and life that each of us is living. To show how insight in science is important in order to be able to act and make decisions in our life, and to show how scientific discoveries make the world more wondrous and interesting, and ultimately to establish a starting point where it is acknowledged that we all have different approaches to understanding scientific insights. The project is not just targeted at children, who would have been the usual target groups of such initiatives, but it's also targeted at adults, because we believe it's important to support the curiosity and learning for all citizens in society. We are working closely with the Science Museum Group and draws on their knowledge and experiences with Science Capital, which is the theoretical framework for the work we are doing. Through different Danish studies into how and why young people engage with science in Denmark, we acknowledge that the British society is very different from the Danish society, making it difficult to copy the initiatives that the Science Museum Group has been doing with Science Capital. Because of this, we are now working on the development of new methods, formats, and tools based on the concept of Science Capital, but is rooted in a Danish context. Everything we're doing at the museum will be made accessible for other institutions, not for you to copy what we are doing, but for you to find inspiration on how you can challenge your own practice. The project is divided into several phases. It's important that data and experiences are being collected systematically, so it's possible to learn from the mistakes and thus continually develop new practice and formats based on previous experiences. It's okay to make mistakes and failures. Only through pushing the boundaries for what a science museum can do and can be are we able to make connections with people who are not using us today. The museum is carrying out 12 experiments, which take place in our existing and new exhibitions and our public and educational programs. I will share 2 of the coming experiences that we are gonna conduct in this fall. We are developing a new public activities inspired by escape rooms and mystery walks, which has become quite popular among young Danes in recent years. This activity is targeted against couples, either as a first date activity or for couples who have been dating and want to do something together. These people are not among our core visitors today, but the hope is to become relevant for these people by finding inspiration in a concept that they are already familiar with. It's important that the activity is developed so the participants do something together, as visiting a museum is often a social event. It's also important that the participants are encouraged to actively use their bodies as well as their minds in order to complete the different tasks. Another aim with this activity is to introduce an activity at the museum which has an estimated time frame. Currently, most of the museum's offering don't have an estimated time frame, which means that visitors who are not familiar with the museum don't know if they should expect to be at the museum for 1 hour or 4 hours. We're developing a mystery walk which has an estimated time span of 45 to 60 minutes, and the concept of the walk is a quest centered around some of the iconic objects in the collection. Another one of our upcoming experiments with this new practice is to make a pop-up museum outside the walls of the museum in order to reach some of the people who would never even think about entering the museum. We have partnered up with Copenhagen Airport and are planning to make a temporary museum in their facilities where travelers can enter the pop-up museum and get a small taste of what a science museum can be. This is a unique opportunity to reach millions of Danes and foreign travelers as they are returning to the airports, and to reach people who may be unfamiliar with a science museum and don't see science museums as something for them. The idea is not to replicate what we are already doing in the museum today, but instead experiments with how we can engage new audiences in science and technology, and then hopefully ignite an interest and curiosity in science. The pop-up museum will be open for at least a year, and we expect more than 1 million visitors to see the pop-up museum, and those being visitors who are not users of the museum today. We have several other experiments in the works for the coming years. In 2022, Denmark will host the first 3 stages of the world's biggest bicycling race, the Tour de France. In connection with this, we will make exhibitions and public activities exploring bicycle culture in Denmark and investigating how science relates to an ordinary bicycle. In 2023, the main thematic focus of the museum will be artificial intelligence. In relation to this, we will conduct several experiments to investigate how we can make science and technology related to artificial intelligence interesting and accessible for people who don't find it relevant for their lives, even though AI is affecting the lives of most people in Denmark already today. The aim is that every single experiment should foster new ideas, knowledge, experiences, and reflections that the museum can use when creating other interventions in the exhibitions, the public, and educational programs. It's a continual effort to developing offerings for a wider selection of people. Museums across the world have faced enormous challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, where many have been forced to shut down for longer periods. It is now up to the employees of the science museums and science centers to decide if we want to use this historic event as a catalyst for creating new and better offerings which are relevant for a wider selection of the public, or if our institutions should return to business as usual and create blockbuster exhibitions that will secure high visitor numbers, though visitors who are already familiar with our institutions. I would argue that the science museums and science centers can use the situation to transform the institutions to be more inclusive, more relevant, and more interesting. These ambitions for the institutions are very much in tune with the thoughts and idea behind Science Capital. That is why I believe Science Capital can be used as a tool and a framework to facilitate this transformation. This is a quote by Harold Skramstad, a Norwegian museum director, who once said, "Unless museums can and do play a role relatively to the real problems of real people's lives, then what is their point?" Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, only about half of the Danish population had visited a museum within the last year. And among those who did visit museums, there was a huge inequality in the educational backgrounds of the visitors. For instance, visitors with longer higher educational background were highly overrepresented at the museums compared to their share in the Danish population, while visitors with lower secondary school educational backgrounds or vocational educational backgrounds were highly underrepresented in the museums. Denmark is a fairly equal and democratic society, so I anticipate that these numbers can only be more alarming in some other countries. At least if we believe that museums, including science museums and science centers, have something to offer for everyone in the society. This was an issue before the COVID-19 pandemic, and this will be an important issue to address in the aftermath of the pandemic, where a lot of institutions are struggling to get visitors back into the museum. Science museums have a unique opportunity to play an active part in the society and address challenges and potentials which are of an importance to citizens today. Current topics must be the starting point of all our activities. There is no need for fear of dealing with conflicting issues, even though some might think less of our institutions if we participate in the public debate about issues such as climate change, vaccinations, refugees, mass surveillance, etc. It's in these zones of non-comfort where hidden opportunities for our institutions lie buried. Thank you very much.